The rain battered against the siding of the old Victorian house in rural Ohio, a rhythmic drumming that usually lulled Frank into a state of whiskey-soaked complacency. He sat in his leather recliner, the television casting a flickering blue light across a face etched with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. For 30 years, Frank had ruled this property and the fractured family within it like a feudal lord, using scripture to justify his wrath and money to silence his mistakes. He took a slow sip of his bourbon, listening to the wind howl through the cornfields outside, feeling the satisfying warmth of ownership. He believed the past was a closed book, buried deep beneath the foundation of the house he had inherited and the lives he had ruined. But the silence of the evening was shattered not by thunder, but by the heavy, deliberate thud of a car door closing in the driveway. Frank frowned, setting his glass down on the coaster with a sharp clink, his eyes narrowing as he peered through the sheer curtains. Headlights cut through the torrential downpour, illuminating the peeling paint of the porch railing, a stark contrast to the immaculate image he projected at Sunday service. It was late, far too late for a social call, and Frank felt a prickle of irritation rise in his chest, the same irritation that used to precede the violence he inflicted on those who disrupted his peace. He stood up, his knees cracking, and smoothed down his shirt, preparing to intimidate whoever dared to trespass on his sanctuary at this hour. When the front door opened, it wasn't with a hesitant knock, but with the turn of a key that hadn't been used in a decade. The wind rushed into the hallway, carrying the scent of wet earth and ozone, and standing in the threshold was a silhouette that Frank recognized only by the set of the shoulders. It was Liam. The boy who had run away at 16, bleeding and crying, was now a man of 26, filling the doorway with a presence that sucked the air out of the room. He wore a dark trench coat that dripped water onto the hardwood floor, and his face, once soft and easily bruised, was now hard, angular, and terrifyingly calm. Frank froze, his initial instinct to shout dying in his throat as he met Liam's eyes. There was no fear in them. The trembling child who used to flinch at the sound of Frank's belt unbuckling was gone, replaced by someone who looked at Frank not as a monster, but as a problem to be solved. Liam stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a gentle click that echoed louder than a slam. He didn't say a word initially. He simply stood there, surveying the hallway, taking in the familiar smell of old wood, lemon polish, and stale tobacco. It was a psychological invasion, a deliberate pause designed to unsettle the older man. "You still haven't fixed the step on the porch," Liam said finally, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated through the tension of the room. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation, delivered with the casual detachment of a building inspector. He walked past Frank, ignoring the older man's stunned posture, and headed straight for the dining room. Frank turned, his face reddening as the shock wore off, and his habitual rage began to simmer. This was his house, his domain, and the audacity of this boy walking in as if he owned the place triggered the old violent circuits in Frank's brain. "You have some nerve showing your face here after 10 years without a word," Frank spat, following him into the dining room. He tried to summon the booming voice that used to make the floorboards shake, but it came out thinner, slightly breathless. "Breaking into my house in the middle of the night. I could have shot you, boy. I have a right to defend my property." He postured, puffing out his chest, trying to re-establish the physical dominance that had been the cornerstone of their relationship. But the dynamic had shifted. The air pressure in the house had changed, and Frank was the only one struggling to breathe. Liam didn't react to the threat. He pulled out a chair at the head of the long oak table, Frank's chair, and sat down, unbuttoning his coat with slow, deliberate movements. The dining room was dimly lit by the chandelier, shadows dancing in the corners, where Liam used to be forced to stand for hours as punishment. "You wouldn't shoot me, Uncle Frank," Liam said, placing his hands on the table, palms flat. "Because you know that if I'm here, it's not because I missed you. It's because I found something, and shooting me wouldn't make it go away." Frank stopped at the edge of the rug, his hands balling into fists. The mention of finding something sent a cold spike of adrenaline through his gut. He had many secrets, business deals that skirted the law, money skimmed from the church fund, the true nature of his discipline, but he had always been careful. He scanned Liam's face for a bluff, for a sign of weakness, but found only a mirror reflecting his own cruelty back at him, refined and controlled. The power dynamic was visibly oscillating, the uncle's brute force clashing against the nephew's cold intellect. "I don't know what kind of drugs you're on, or what kind of trouble you're in, but you get out of my house now," Frank growled, pointing a shaking finger at the door. "I raised you when nobody else wanted you. I put clothes on your back, and this is how you repay me?" With vague threats, he fell back on his favorite narrative. The benevolent patriarch burdened by an ungrateful family. It was the story he told the neighbors, the story he told the pastor, the story he had almost convinced himself was true. Liam reached into the inner pocket of his coat. Frank flinched, instinctively stepping back, expecting a weapon. Instead, Liam withdrew a thick manila envelope. It was worn at the edges, sealed with tape, and looked like it had been pulled from a dark, forgotten drawer. He placed it gently on the center of the table. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was whisper quiet, yet it seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent house. Liam looked up, a small, sad smile playing on his lips, the same smile Frank used to mock him for when he was a child. "I visited the old county clerk's office before I came here," Liam said softly. "And I stopped by the bank. Turns out Aunt Mary didn't just die of natural causes like you told everyone, did she? And the insurance money? Well, that didn't go to my college fund like Mom intended." The specificity of the accusation hit Frank like a physical blow. His face went pale, the red rage draining away to leave a sickly grey pallor. The secrets he thought were buried under layers of bureaucracy and time were sitting right there on his dining table. "That's nonsense," Frank stammered, his voice losing its bass. "You're lying. You're trying to extort me." But his eyes were fixed on the envelope, terrified of what lay inside. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, suffocating. The rain outside seemed to intensify, hammering against the windows as if demanded entry to witness the collapse. This wasn't just a family reunion. It was an execution of character, and the blindfold had just been removed. Frank's wife, Sarah, appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face a mask of habitual anxiety. She had heard the voices, the familiar tone of Frank's aggression, and the unexpected depth of another man's voice. When she saw Liam, her eyes widened, filling with a mixture of hope and terror. She looked from her husband to her nephew, sensing the volatile energy in the room. In this house, conflict always resulted in someone getting hurt, and for years she had been the collateral damage of Frank's temper. She stayed silent, hugging the wall, a ghost in her own home. "Sarah, go back to bed," Frank barked, trying to regain control over at least one person in the room. He turned his back on Liam, focusing his glare on his wife. "This doesn't concern you. The boy is leaving." It was a test of loyalty, a demand for the old order to be restored. Usually Sarah would shrink away, obedient and fearful, but tonight she didn't move. She looked at the envelope on the table, then at Liam's calm face, and something in her posture shifted. She didn't leave. She stayed, watching, her silence no longer submissive but expectant. Liam acknowledged her with a nod, ignoring Frank's command. "Hello, Aunt Sarah. You look tired." His voice was gentle, a stark contrast to the steel he used with his uncle. "You should stay. You need to hear this too. In fact, you're the one who needs to hear this the most." Frank spun around, his face contorted. He realized that isolating Liam was impossible now. The audience was assembled, and his performance as the righteous head of the household was failing. He needed to change tactics, to switch from intimidation to manipulation, a skill he had honed over decades. "You think you can just waltz in here and poison my wife against me?" Frank said, lowering his voice to a dangerous hiss. He walked to the sideboard and poured himself another drink, his hand trembling slightly. You were always a troubled kid, Liam. A liar. Remember when you stole money from the collection plate? Remember how you used to make up stories to get attention at school? He was gaslighting, trying to rewrite history in real time, hoping that if he said it with enough conviction, reality would bend to his will. I didn't steal that money, Frank. You put it in my pocket so you could beat me for it later, Liam replied, his voice devoid of emotion. He wasn't debating, he was stating facts. And the stories at school? I told the teachers I fell down the stairs because you told me that if I said the truth, you'd put Sarah in the hospital next. The mention of that specific threat hung in the air. Sarah let out a small, stifled gasp. It was a memory she had suppressed, a cornerstone of the fear that kept her trapped. Frank's glass paused halfway to his mouth. The psychological warfare intensified. Frank laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You're delusional. You've clearly failed out there in the real world and came back looking for a handout. That's what this is, isn't it? Blackmail? He took a sip of whiskey, regaining some composure. Go ahead. Open your envelope. Show me whatever forged nonsense you have. I have lawyers, Liam. I have friends in this town. You're a nobody, a drifter. Frank was betting on his status, on the intricate web of influence he had built in the small town where everyone knew his name but not his nature. Liam leaned forward, his elbows on the table. I'm not a drifter, Uncle. I'm a forensic accountant. I look at numbers for a living. I look for the things people try to hide in the margins. The revelation struck Frank. A forensic accountant. The boy he had called stupid, the boy he had claimed would never amount to anything, had made a career out of hunting men exactly like Frank. The irony was sharp and bitter. Liam continued, And I didn't come for money. I have plenty. I came for the truth. Frank paced the room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He felt the walls closing in. The physical intimidation hadn't worked, the gaslighting was failing, and now his social standing was being threatened. He looked at the heavy brass candlestick on the mantel, a dark thought crossing his mind, but he dismissed it. Liam was too big now, too alert. Violence was a tool for the weak against the weaker, and Frank suddenly felt very old and very slow. He felt the gaze of his wife burning into his back, a sensation he wasn't used to. You don't know what it takes to keep a family afloat, Frank muttered, trying the victim angle. The sacrifices I made, the stress, sometimes a man, sometimes he loses his temper. It doesn't mean I didn't love you. It was a pathetic attempt at reconciliation, a twisting of the definition of love to include abuse. It was the same logic he used to apologize after breaking a bone or a spirit. Look what you made me do because I care so much. Love. Liam repeated the word as if it were a foreign object. Is that what you call it? Breaking my arm when I was 12 because I spilled milk? Locking me in the basement for 2 days? Liam stood up slowly, and Frank instinctively stepped back. That wasn't love, Frank. That was power. You loved feeling powerful. You loved knowing we were afraid. Liam walked around the table, moving closer to the envelope but not touching it yet. The object remained the focal point of the room, a bomb waiting to detonate. The statute of limitations on a lot of things has passed, Frank sneered, trying to regain legal ground. You can't prove anything happened in this house 20 years ago. It's your word against mine. And who are they going to believe? The pillar of the community or the runaway? He felt a surge of confidence. The law was often on the side of the established, the wealthy, the ones who stayed. He believed the system protected men like him because men like him built the system. You're right about the physical abuse, Liam conceded, stopping right in front of his uncle. It's hard to prove bruises that healed a decade ago, but fraud, tax evasion, embezzlement from the trust fund of a minor. Liam's eyes were cold, calculating. Paper trails don't heal, Frank. They don't forget. And the statute of limitations on the fraud you committed when you forged my signature 3 years ago, that hasn't expired. Frank's mouth fell open. He had forgotten about that, a desperate move to cover a bad investment using Liam's old identity documents. He thought Liam was gone forever. dead in a ditch somewhere. He never thought the ghost would come back to audit the books. Frank lunged for the envelope. It was a desperate, animalistic movement, stripped of all dignity. He scrambled across the dining table, knocking over the centerpiece, his fingers clawing for the paper. But Liam was faster. He didn't snatch it away. He simply placed his hand firmly on top of it, pinning it to the table. Frank froze, his hand trembling inches from Liam's, his breathing ragged and heavy. The physical contact, the first in years, was electric with hatred. Frank looked up into Liam's face and saw the absolute certainty of his own defeat. "Open it," Liam whispered. He lifted his hand. Frank hesitated. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Slowly, with shaking fingers, he tore open the seal. He pulled out the documents. They weren't just bank statements. There were photocopies of forged deeds, letters Frank had written to his lawyer discussing how to hide assets, and crucially, a copy of a medical report from the night Liam's mother, Frank's sister, had died. A report Frank had paid a corrupt coroner to suppress. As Frank read the papers, the color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse. The silence in the room was absolute. Sarah stepped forward, drawn by the gravity of Frank's reaction. She reached out and took a sheet of paper from Frank's limp hand. It was the medical report. Her eyes scanned the technical jargon, but the conclusion was clear. Blunt force trauma consistent with a fall, but with defensive wounds present. It wasn't an accident, it never was. "You told me she fell down the stairs drunk," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "You told everyone she was an alcoholic. You made us ashamed of her." She looked at Frank with a horror that transcended fear. The man she had lived with, the man she had feared but respected as a provider, was a monster of a different breed entirely. He hadn't just been strict. He had built their entire life on the foundation of a homicide he had successfully reframed as a tragedy. "It was an accident," Frank screamed, the sound tearing through the room. "She came at me. She was hysterical. I just pushed her away." The confession hung in the air, irrevocable. He had spent years controlling the narrative, ensuring no one ever questioned the official story. But faced with the paper trail Liam had unearthed, proof that Frank had transferred her savings to his account 2 days before she died, the accidental defense crumbled. The financial motive was clear. It was murder for profit disguised as a domestic tragedy. Liam watched his uncle unravel. This was the moment he had replayed in his mind for 1,000 nights. He expected to feel triumph, a surge of joy. Instead, he felt a profound, hollow sadness. He saw a pathetic, aging man screaming at pieces of paper, trying to argue with ink and facts. "It's over, Frank," Liam said quietly. "I've already sent copies to the district attorney, and to the church board, and to your business partners." Frank stopped screaming. He stared at Liam, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The realization of the scope of Liam's revenge hit him. It wasn't just a legal threat. It was total annihilation. You sent them," Frank whispered. "Everything?" He collapsed into his chair, the fight draining out of him. The house, his castle, suddenly felt like a prison cell. The walls he had built to keep the world out were now keeping him in with his sins. "Why?" Frank asked, his voice broken. "Why destroy everything? I'm your family." It was the last refuge of the abuser, appealing to the bond they had systematically destroyed. He looked small in the chair. The grandeur of the master of the house evaporated. He was just an old man who had done terrible things and was finally being presented with the bill. "Because you never stopped," Liam replied. He pointed to Sarah. "You're still doing it to her. You're still bullying the town. You think because time passes, guilt disappears. But it doesn't." Liam looked at his aunt. "Sarah, pack a bag. You're not staying here tonight." It was an order, but given with kindness. Sarah looked at Frank, then at the door. For the first time in 30 years, the fear of leaving was less than the horror of staying. Frank put his head in his hands. The sound of the rain outside was deafening now, a cleansing deluge. The facade was broken. The image of the pious, strict, successful man was shattered on the dining room table, buried under photocopies of his own greed and violence. He realized with a sickening lurch that he wouldn't be going to church on Sunday. He wouldn't be going anywhere ever again as a free man. "You ungrateful bastard," Frank muttered into his hands, sobbing. But it lacked heat. It was just the habitual noise of a machine that was broken. Liam didn't respond. He simply gathered the papers back into the envelope, leaving only the copies on the table for the police, who would inevitably arrive in the morning. The breaking point had been reached and passed. The explosion was over. Now came the dust. The hours that followed were a blur of quiet activity amidst the ruins of a lifetime. Sarah moved through the house like a sleepwalker, packing a suitcase with the few possessions that felt truly hers. She avoided looking at Frank, who remained slumped in the dining room chair, staring blankly at the wall. The power dynamic in the house had completely inverted. Frank, once the source of all gravity, was now a void, ignored and irrelevant. The phone began to ring, likely the church board members or business partners checking their emails late at night, but Frank didn't move to answer it. The ringing echoed through the house, a shrill alarm signaling the end of his social life. Liam sat in the living room, watching the headlights of passing cars on the distant road. He felt exhausted, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that had nothing to do with travel. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind the jagged reality of the situation. He had destroyed his uncle, yes, but he had also blown up the only family structure, however toxic, that his aunt had known. He watched Sarah come down the stairs, her coat buttoned wrong, clutching a handbag. She looked at the living room, at the furniture she had dusted for decades, with the eyes of a stranger. "Where will I go?" she asked, her voice trembling. It was a practical question, born of a dependency Frank had cultivated. She had no money of her own, no friends he hadn't approved of. Frank had made sure she was helpless without him. Liam stood up and took her bag. "I booked a hotel room in the next town over for tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we'll talk to a lawyer about the assets. Half of this is yours, Sarah, probably more considering the fraud." In the dining room, Frank finally stirred. He poured another drink, his hand steady now with the calm of the condemned. He heard the front door open. He heard the sound of footsteps leaving. He didn't run after them. He didn't shout. He knew it was useless. The psychological hold he had on them was broken by the truth. He looked at the papers on the table again. The evidence was irrefutable. He thought about the men in prison, the kind of men he used to preach against. He was going to be one of them. The shame was a cold, physical weight in his stomach, heavier than the fear of jail. As Liam and Sarah walked to the car, the rain began to ease, turning into a cold mist. Sarah stopped at the passenger door and looked back at the house. The lights were still on, a beacon in the dark countryside. "He looks so small," she whispered. It wasn't forgiveness. It was pity. Pity for the waste of a life, for the cruelty that had consumed him until there was nothing left but a bitter old man in a big, empty house. "He was always small, Aunt Sarah," Liam said, opening the door for her. "We were just on our knees, so he looked tall." Inside the car, the heater blasted warm air, defrosting the chill of the house. As they drove away, Liam watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror. He expected to feel a sense of lightness, but the weight of the past was sticky. He thought about his mother, about the justice that had come 2 decades too late. The consequences of tonight would ripple out for years. Trials, scandals, the sale of the house. It wasn't a clean break. It was a messy amputation. Back in the house, Frank stood up and walked to the window. He watched the taillights fade into the mist. The silence of the house was absolute now. No hum of the refrigerator, no creak of the floorboards could fill the emptiness. He was the king of a wasteland. He thought about calling his lawyer, but he knew the man would likely distance himself immediately. Frank realized he had no allies. His relationships were transactional, based on fear or profit. With both gone, he was alone. He walked to the hallway mirror and looked at himself. He saw the lines of age, the grey skin, the eyes of a bully who had finally met someone he couldn't intimidate. He smashed the glass with his fist, not in a rage, but in a desire to stop seeing the truth. The shards fell to the floor, reflecting fragmented pieces of a broken man. He sat on the stairs, bleeding onto the carpet, waiting for the morning and the inevitable sirens. The empire had fallen, not with a war, but with a whisper of truth. 6 months later, the house stood empty, a for sale sign leaning crookedly in the overgrown yard. The grass, once manicured to obsessive perfection under Frank's tyranny, was now knee-high, reclaiming the land. The windows were dark, stripping the building of its imposing character. Now it was just wood and brick, rotting slowly in the humid Midwest summer. Liam parked his car across the street, looking at the structure. He didn't feel the old dread anymore. The monster that lived there was gone, currently residing in a state penitentiary 3 counties over, awaiting trial for fraud and manslaughter. Liam wasn't there to gloat. He was there to meet a real estate agent to finalize the sale. The proceeds would go to Sarah, who had moved to a small condo in Florida near her sister. She was learning to live again, taking painting classes, waking up without a knot in her stomach. She wasn't healed. She still flinched at loud noises, still apologized too much, but she was free. That was the only victory that mattered. Liam got out of the car, the summer heat pressing down on him. He walked up the driveway, noticing the cracks in the asphalt, where weeds were pushing through. The impermanence of Frank's control was evident everywhere. Nature didn't care about Frank's rules. Liam stepped onto the porch. The step he had mentioned that first night was still broken. He carefully stepped over it and unlocked the door. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust and abandonment. The furniture was gone, sold or trashed. The house felt smaller, stripped of the ego that had filled it. He walked to the dining room. The table was gone. The spot where the confrontation had happened was just empty floor space. Liam stood there, closing his eyes, listening. He didn't hear Frank's voice anymore. He heard the traffic outside, the birds, the wind. The ghosts had been evicted along with the tenant. He realized that for years he had carried this house inside him, a mental architecture of trauma. Now, seeing it empty, he could finally begin to dismantle it in his mind. There was no magical sense of joy. Liam knew that exposing Frank didn't bring his mother back. It didn't erase the years of abuse. The scars on his back and in his psyche remained. But the cycle was broken. He had ensured that Frank would never hurt anyone else. He had used the pain to forge a weapon, his career, his intellect, and he had used it to cut the cancer out of his family. It was a grim satisfaction, a realistic peace. The real estate agent arrived, a cheerful woman who knew nothing of the house's history, only that it had good bones. She talked about potential, about young families, about fresh paint. Liam nodded, signing the papers on the kitchen counter. He sold the past for a check that would secure his aunt's future. It was a transaction, cold and necessary. As he left the house for the final time, Liam didn't look back. He got into his car and started the engine. He checked his phone. He had a case in Chicago waiting for him, another set of books to audit, another hidden truth to uncover. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who knew where the bodies were buried and how to dig them up. He merged onto the highway, the house shrinking in the mirror until it was just a speck, then nothing. The road ahead was open, and for the first time in his life, Liam was driving toward something rather than running away.